to the second presentation, which I'm preparing, and okay, everyone can see this? Okay, awesome. All right. Thanks for attending. And I'm going to truncate my presentation a little bit to make sure that we end in the hour. But what I'm going to give is an overview of the SUSTAIN program. Steve mentioned this. It's one of the NuScale efforts. And we started this program. Steve contacted me about trying to go for this DOE NE supported project. And through developing of a great team, we successfully were awarded the program, and we haven't been doing it quite a year. So I'm going to give an overview of the project and some update on where we're at. So the team is shown here. It's University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Morgan State University, University of Maryland, Impact Allies, RCNet, and of course, NuScale. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the project. I'll give some information on our team. I'll talk about the tasks, and then I'll just emphasize where we're at in tasks 1 and task 4. And one of the things that we tried to emphasize within the SUSTAIN program is really we want to develop a gap analysis. We want to see what knowledge is needed for the nuclear industry to be successful in terms of training the new workers. And not only that, not only just provide the gap analysis, which I think the DOE would have been okay with, but since we're a lot of us are educational institutions, is also develop content that would help address the gap analysis. So there's one part, which is actually the first 3 tasks are really designed to getting towards the gap analysis. And the 4th task is really taking that information, what we're learning, and designing modules that train and educate. And I really want to emphasize that training and education, Steve brought it up in terms of the different types of education levels that are needed in the nuclear power plant. We want to do this same thing with the educational content, but even broaden that. And that's where, all the collaborators have certain expertise, and that's where the expertise from Morgan State comes into play. So I'm going to describe our team and where we're at. So this project was initiated about a year ago, and we wanted to develop a comprehensive and as something that we can action on, so that a diverse pool of skilled workers is available to support the viability of nuclear power in the United States. We're going to do this through an evaluation of previous workforce assessments. And I put over here the nuclear renaissance. Those of you who may have been doing this for a while, in 2005, this was from Bush, where we were going to go forward to start. It was a government effort to reinvigorate the nuclear industry. We didn't quite build the plants, but there were certainly some documents provided from that time that discuss workforce needs. So it's nice that we have data that we can mine that not only talks about overall workforce in the United States, but some aspects that are based on nuclear. So there's these sort of documents that are available. We want to have outreach to those in the workforce that are going to be the supply, the demand, and the training, right? So the workers themselves, the people are going to be hiring them, and the training, that's educational institutions at a number of different levels. And this is where Ben and Kevin are really instrumental, because they've been doing this for over a decade. They were engaged in RCNet, which is really instrumental in developing the skills that are necessary for the current generation of nuclear power plants. We're also interested in having some outreach with some workforce entities to understand what are their expectations, very similar to what Steve had discussed, and development of content for training the future workforce. We want to use the gap analysis for that area. So, we want to do this. We want to provide a comprehensive understanding of what's impacting worker supply and demand. What addresses the demand for workers, and what's addresses the supply. And that's actually, this is not my area of expertise. Luckily, we have, Jaewon from UNLV is an expert in this area, and I've learned a lot within the last year. And I'd also say that this current time, the workforce has been definitely impacted and is varied compared to other times. And I see, Steve, you even kind of brought that up in your NuScale discussion. But we want to talk about what are the economic prospects for individual workers, demand for workers from competing sectors, perceptions on nuclear power, the actual pace of nuclear power increase. And that, some of these are hard to pin down. The actual pace of nuclear power increase we can project. But a lot of this, what is going to come out is that there's a lot of uncertainties in how one develops the workforce. And that's something that as a team, we're going to need to address, especially if we're thinking about educational institutions as this point of training. How do you convince educational institutions to invest in the necessary training for the workforce with the uncertainty? But actually, I would say that our CNET has experience with this. And this is something that we've actually built into the project to assess the uncertainty. So our team, the people are listed here. And I'm going to briefly just go over this. We have expertise in nuclear technology, workforce development, and technology transfer at UNLV. Morgan State has excellent expertise in K through 12 and undergraduate STEM education. A lot of this is, I would say, they're leveraging their experience and knowledge and capabilities with NASA, basically addressing the same, it looks like the same sort of issues for NASA. How do you get the next generation of people interested in STEM? University of Maryland with their nuclear engineering department. They have a nuclear focus, probabilistic hazard and risk assessment, data analysis, regulatory framework, and also importantly, that they have a radiation facility there. So UNLV, we have laboratories where we can work with radioactive material, and University of Maryland has a research reactor. So that allows us to develop modules and opportunities to train people where we can actually think about using radioactive material. In fact, Steve, there was one question that I had in the presentation you showed from Idaho State for where they were doing some work in a glove box. I was wondering if that was with actual material. I don't know if you know that or not.
Yeah, I believe it was not.
Okay, yeah, because they look kind of calm. So but and I'll talk about this within our task 4. NuScale is another team member. Steve described what they do very well. Impact Allies, Ben, who was they're involved in research, development, educational advancement for STEM education, career opportunities, and this these presentations. This is something that Ben really spearheaded. So I thank him to get us more engaged with the community. And then RCNet, which is Regional Center for Nuclear Education and Training. It was established through National Science Foundation in 2001 to address nuclear workforce issues. And Kevin Cooper is engaged in RCNet, and he's also the dean of Indian River State College. And I'd say that this is very helpful for us because it's an example of what's been tried already, and certainly they have experience with this with RCNet where educational institutions have developed activities related to training the nuclear workforce. Some are still doing that, and some aren't. So we can learn from that previous experience of why that occurred and how to mitigate that or address it or deal with it in the future. And as Steve mentioned, we have a lot of external entities. And I would say that Steve was pretty instrumental in getting the bulk of this list. Most of these are, as you would look, would be energy production. Holtec is, I would say, more on the decommissioning side, but they also might be considered energy production within that area. We've also had interactions with the waste isolation pilot plant. One of the things that the proposal did talk about was some ancillary areas outside of nuclear, so nuclear waste disposal. The fact that we are working with people from WIP. Yeah, and talks about what sort of workforce needs that they have and how can that act as a way of increasing the need for the supply, but also as a buffer so that the uncertainties that we have to deal with in terms of addressing the workforce can be mitigated. Idaho National Lab we've already had conversations with them. And I do want to point out that we also have interactions with United Arab Emirates. And that's what's nice. That's Tony Hechanova, who actually initiated what we're doing at UNLV. So he's been at United Arab Emirates, and what he's been doing is developing their education and training program for their nuclear reactors. Right. So the tasks are listed here. Task 1, we're just going to look at some insights, integrate the insights and lessons learned from existing workforce evaluations, and use existing data to evaluate the workforce. Task 2 is going to look at workforce needs challenges across diverse organizations involved in the nuclear fuel cycle. So industry, national laboratories, government agencies. We're also going to look at factors influencing decisions of students and professionals begin careers with or change to careers in the nuclear industry. So how do we get people to remain in the industry? How do we get people from other industries that are similar into the nuclear industry? And as Steve pointed out, some of these will also include how do you train people from one industry like coal and put them into nuclear? And then ways that education institutes can serve as the link, right? So that's as educators, those of us involved in the project at universities, how do we deal with bringing these two groups together, and how do we deal with the uncertainties for starting programs in terms of the number of people that we would need to train? The task 3 is going to talk about an integrated assessment to understand the current state of the nuclear industry. We would like to talk with as many nuclear industry personnel as possible. Existing reactor technologies, all part of the nuclear fuel cycle. So that also includes WIP and waste areas. We want to really try to project out, and I would say that this is something that Steve drove in our discussions in the project development, is looking out on the order of 20 years. And how do we think, how do we talk about what is the workforce going to need? What are they going to look like within 20 years? Obviously, that uncertainty is going to get, if we're having current uncertainties in 20 years, they're going to be high, but we should really figure out how to do with that. And within task 3, it's really going to be the heart of what we want to do, take information from task 1 and task 2 and perform a gap analysis. The differences between projected demands and supply for the workers. And the one thing I do want to point out, if you look in some, let's say, literature from the Department of Energy related to the United States meeting is greenhouse gas reduction goals, we would need around 200 gigawatts from new nuclear by 2050 to meet the goals. And we can obtain data that talks about the number of workers needed per gigawatt. And that also will depend a little bit upon the reactor type, because the NuScale reactor will have a lower value per unit energy produced than a traditional reactor. It's also going to depend upon how close. So there'll be variability in the amount of small modular reactor versus, let's say, standard reactor within this value. Then what percentage of this number is actually attained? And I do want to point out that this is around twice the current amount, right? So there's around 100 reactors, a little bit less. Each reactor is 1 gigawatt nominally. I'm doing some very rough math here. So in order to reach this, we would need new reactors that are equivalent to twice of what we're already producing from nuclear. And then task 4 takes the information from the gap analysis, and we want to be able to train people based upon what we've learned. So we want to, really target representatives of educational, develop educational content across all levels. So not only for, if like us at UNLV and the radiochemistry program, we have a graduate program, we're pretty good at that, but we're going to need, the driver for getting it to the lower levels are going to be our interactions with our colleagues elsewhere within the project. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about task 1. And Jaywan, if I make any mistakes, you can correct me. But this is just a broad overview. And one of the things we did initially is identify what are the workforce occupations in nuclear power plants. And Jaewon went from a very traditional, in terms of his workforce analysis that he's done for other areas, looking at available resources and databases within the United States. They're listed here, ONET, and it talks about occupation classification, education requirements, experience, training. And then the Bureau of Labor Statistics has occupational projections, work characteristics, everything from the expected number to the salary ranges of people. So it has a lot of detailed information. So what was really good about this, this data was collected and then we iterated within sustained team members to talk about maybe there were some occupations that were missed or some that were listed as nuclear that may not have been as relevant. But this is really driving a detailed assessment of the database. So for instance, with Bureau of Labor Statistics, trying to get an understanding of where does their data come from. It comes from responses, but what's the response rate? Who's responding? So you can have a database, but understanding any biases that are inherent in the database, that's something that we started to look at. Okay, this is an example. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, just because I want to end by 1 o'clock. One of the things, okay, this was the assessment of all occupations in all industries. What's being demonstrated, and this again, what's something Steve showed, is that the growth is led by occupations requiring the lowest levels of education. The occupation of the numbers of the highest levels are not required in large number, which is actually nice in terms of trying to deal with uncertainty, because this gives you some flexibility in developing education and training regimes. If it takes a long time to produce a PhD, but it can take a third of the time to produce someone at a trade school or as an associate level. Now, the occupations with the highest growth rates also have the lowest wages. And one thing about the wages that we're looking at and trying to assess is that the wages are at a national level rather than a regional level. So we kind of need to tease that information out. Think about where reactors are going to be placed. How does that compare nationally? And then the wages are reported for occupations in all industries and not the nuclear industry exclusively. And this is some of what was interesting. This is some interesting output. There were a number of occupations that were examined for the nuclear power generation industry. In 2021, there was a number of how many were employed, and then there's a projection, and this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There was a projection that would actually be a decrease in a number of these occupations, and then there were some select occupations within there, and again, there was a decrease. So this is the number of people that were employed in these selected occupations in 2021, the projected in 2031, so in 10 years. And this is the percent total of all those workers in the US workforce. So the nuclear is relatively small amount, so there might be some buffer capacity in there to think about. But it also says from the Bureau of Labor Statistics data that there'll be a decrease in the number of nuclear. Is this really accurate? Is this reflecting the total demand in nuclear power? This is an example of some data that's from the nuclear liftoff, and the document reference is shown here, where the number of jobs per gigawatt are shown here for nuclear and other sources. So if nuclear grows, this is for a small modular reactor. This is for a non-small modular reactor. And even within our group, we've had debates about whether or not this number is accurate. It seems to be somewhat low. So even within the references, there's a lot of uncertainty. But what this says, if the United States reaches its goal of 200 gigawatts of additional nuclear, these jobs, these permanent on-site jobs, are going to increase, because these are jobs per gigawatt hour. So, excuse me, gigawatt. So the idea is when I look at this, trying to come up with dealing with the uncertainty to address the potential for the variations in the expected workforce needs. And I think we're going to sharpen that over time. Now, there's been a reduction in the number of nuclear power plants. If you look here, Southern Company, there's a few other references we could have used, but Southern Company is developing some nuclear. So if you look at the total number of nuclear power plants, it's kind of dipped and now it's coming back up. So the trend certainly seems to be going higher, a little bit different than what we saw in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And then, so there's this, we seem to be entering a phase where we need more nuclear workers, but we also need to figure out this new nuclear that we're going to be adding, what's the pace of it coming on? And what's nice is that we can assess some previous work that was done. In 2013, there was an estimate that there were 10,000 nuclear workers needed in Georgia and South Carolina, the Nuclear Workforce Initiative. This is an example of a database. And this is something that we're going to interact with, particularly Savannah River National Lab, to see how these numbers compared to the actual number of people that were hired. And I would say the outcome is that we're going to need to address these uncertainties. We've already started doing some strategic outreach. Shelby was chair of a session on workforce uncertainties and risk at ANS meeting. And then we've also give some presentations. Steve mentioned some presentations that he's given. We've also presented this to the NEAC Workforce and the Future Workforce of the Future subcommittee. And what I quickly want to end is some content development. And this is something we're doing at UNLV. This is based upon some modules that we've worked on where we're basically taking some uranyl nitrate, going to ammonia diurenate, and then making some UO2 pellets out of it. We're developing this into a module. Initially, this is based upon some labs that we performed at UNLV for some of our summer schools. We're going to work with colleagues from Morgan State and University of Maryland on how to tune these more so they can be a little bit more portable, so they can provide experiences for other students who can work in laboratories with activity. And we're also going to film it and then work with our colleagues so that that can be the basis of education content at appropriate levels, everything from grade school, the parents of grade schoolers, to high school, university, and graduate school. And just wanted to just showing this. So the key points, we're going to test this module. The Morgan State group is going to come out here and test this out. Then we're going to learn from that. And then at UNLV through the College of Science, we can provide film for them and they'll help us edit it. So the university is going to be pretty fundamental in this. So right now, this is where we're at. We're ending, I'm almost at month 12. So task 1, we've got about another 6 months to go to finish up the lessons learned, the strategic outreach. We've started this and we're really going to move forward. And this is going to be an area where we really want to get input from the industry, from those involved in nuclear, Department of Energy, and different parts of the Department of Energy, even national security or environmental management, certainly NE. Task 3 is going to be the gap analysis, really understanding, where we are, where do we need to be in the next 20 years, and then taking the gap analysis information and using what we've done already to develop content, identify new content to develop, and utilize the tools we've had to broadcast it. And this is, hopefully something like this can be useful when we were talking about TikTok or other means of social media. I don't know, perhaps we can even think about doing a TikTok of making UO2 fuel, right? Maybe we should embrace that. And this is our support through the Department of Energy. And I'd like to just end by thanking you for your time. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I have one question. Will the slides be made available?
I will certainly, yeah. So I'd be happy to, in fact, Steve, I was going to ask you that. I can send a copy of the slides out to everybody, or I could put them in a location where, well, I'll do that. I'll put them in a location. And if anyone wants to get to them, they can just upload them as opposed to me filling your inbox with more spam.
Hey, Ken, this is paying just a quick aside. What about the NSER training for Los Alamos and, criticality? Is there some there for the university to take advantage of that?
So are you offering up us the facility at the Nevada, at the NNSS, so we can do some criticality training?
That's a Los Alamos facility.
Well, I would say yes. So yeah, I think that would be awesome.
Yeah, criticality for the students, right?
Right, exactly.
See that they go up.
Yeah, and that would actually be something that we could facilitate through UNLV, because we've been able to train students here and have them go to the test site. So the idea is that particularly for students that have a very high interest in nuclear, giving them the opportunity to observe a criticality experiment at the Nevada test site using the enriched facilities there.
Yeah, that's something we need to rope Los Alamos online, right? Maybe get them to think about it.
Yeah, I think I would know. I think I know some of the people that we can talk to about that.
Okay, I love it, Steve. Your presentation was wonderful. So I'll just put on mute now. I'll look for the slides.
And Max French says there's a professor, Robert Hayes, who does TikToks at NC State.
I'll be there in 3 weeks, so I'll look them up.
Cool. All right.
Ken, one thing I'd say too, you introduced Diego in the beginning and you said, would you like to speak? So perhaps I'd like to just extend that to everybody that's on the call. You all know kind of this platform now. We thank you for joining, and it's a great way to disseminate direct to the folks that are working in your space. So if you would, drop your name in the chat or email Ken directly, and we'll be in touch to kind of set that up over the next year. Is that
right?
About appropriate, Ken?
And those people who've registered, I've collected the emails. That was part of the Google Forms. And one of the questions was, would you like to give a presentation? Right. And it was yes, and not at this time. But there was no no.
Right. I forgot you're already ahead of it. Yeah. Good.
But absolutely, we're very interested in hearing from other interested parties in the community. All right. Okay. If there's nothing else, I'd like to thank everyone for their time. This has been very enjoyable. I always have a great time when I interface with the Sustain team, and then bringing all extra people just made it even more fun. So thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your